It's wonderful to see you for the New York launch of this tiny book called Pkhentz. Some of you, I'm sure, have not only heard about it but also read it, and some probably have worked with it in many other ways. I have in mind particularly the multiple spin-offs of this original short story that was written in 1957 by Abram Tertz, which was the pen name for Andrei Sushinsky. At the time, he was a rather high-ranking Soviet critic, but as he wrote official literary criticism in the 50s and onward in the 60s, actually starting from the Stalinist period, from the 40s, he was also having an alternative life and career as an underground author under the pen name of Abram Tertz. Tertz, of course, comes from a song famous at the time and earlier from Odessa, which kind of glorifies this Jewish thug. And so the concept of crime, if only territorial crime, is kind of built into this creative strategy from the very beginning. And one crime in particular that he and his fellow author Yuli Daniel also wrote under the pen name of Nikolai Arzak, the crime that they were ultimately in 1966 sentenced respectively to 7 and 5 years of hard labor, was sending these unorthodox and unconventional works of fiction abroad for publication, first in Paris and then in translations in multiple other foreign languages, including Russian, the Russian originals, of course, even if most of their works actually first saw the light of day in translation. Often in Polish, in French. Pkhentz was first published in English, actually, in the magazine called Descent, which still comes out in 1966. This is kind of the background of the authors and the text, which I will not be spoiling too much here because we are about to hear excerpts, 14-page long or so short story. So the reason it was kind of delayed, I just said it was first published in 66 and not soon after 1957 when it was written, is that even the author, Sushinsky, was carried away and couldn't resist the temptation of reading it to a very narrow circle of his friends, given just how passionate I think he was about this character, about the genre of this little piece, that he did ultimately read it out loud, Sushinsky, and soon enough he realized that one of the people in the audience actually was an informer. And had he published it in '59 when his other writings signed with the name of Abram Tertz, had he published it abroad, it would have, of course, ruined the whole mystification. And the whole strategy would have been exposed much sooner than it was ultimately only in 65, 66. So for about 8 years, it remained a literary and, of course, political mystification. No one in the world, other than perhaps just several people, knew who these two authors were, Abram Tertz and Nikolai Arzak. And there were tons of rumors just as to who they could have been. Some suspected they were immigrants in Israel. Others insisted that could only be someone in the Soviet Union, given how detailed and clinically detailed this reality is described. Others suspected the Slavist from Yale University, and so on and so on. Yeah, so just to read these assumptions is already quite a literary experience. And so it was for the first time published only in 1966, soon after the trial, the infamous show trial of Sinyavsky and Daniel in Moscow in February 1966. It was from February 10th to February 14th, so almost these days. And since then it has never been retranslated into English. Not that I know of any translations into any other languages that would have appeared since those days. So this gives me a pleasure to introduce the English translator of this masterpiece of Soviet literature, or of literature of the Soviet period, Ainsley Morse, who of course is remarkable not only for translation of Pkhentz, but for her translations of Tynyanov, of Galina Rimbu, most recently, a Ukrainian poet. The way it happened was absolutely spontaneous. Not only this book was not really planned as a book, but even the translation wasn't really. Ainsley visited Tamizdat Project summer school in Riga just this summer and casually mentioned that this was one of the short stories she has always dreamt of translating into English for a few number of years. It's the first book that published by Tamizdat Project, and this is how this project also became, I dare say, a publishing house. Not so much of a house, but the publishing initiative was
Publishing Budichka.
Maybe I shouldn't say anything else right now, because Ainsley and Zhenya will also be commenting very briefly on the passages they have chosen.
I want to start by saying that this book is called Pkhentz in English and in Russian. I've selected a few passages that I hope maybe get a little closer to what Pkhentz might mean, but I will offer one partial interpretation that is not meant to be exhaustive, which is that many of you may have read, starting back in like the early 2000s, these cartoons by Linor Gararik called Pkhentz. And I'll just note that the first and last letters of the word Pkhentz are the same as those of Gararik's rabbit, which points to a bad word in Russian. Technically, he is not he, but again, he has adopted some human features to get by in his 1950s Soviet circumstances. The story opens with him tracking a hunchback who he suspects might also be an alien like himself. But I'm skipping over that part, and we're going to dive right into his life in the communal apartment, where he is tormented by an evil neighbor called Kastritska and pursued by a lovely young woman called Veronika. In order to encourage you to take home your very own copy, we're just going to read some pieces, which will be great for everyone who's already read the story, and maybe a little bit mysterious for those who have not.
Дома была обычно. Едва я вошел к себе, появилась Вероника. Она, потупив глаза, предложила вместе поужинать. Не было ни с руки отказывать этой девушке. Она единственная из всей квартиры относится ко мне сносно. Жаль, что ее сочувствие зиждется на сексуальной основе. Сегодня я окончательно мог в том убедиться. «Как поживает Кострицкая?» – спросил я Веронику, стараясь направить беседу в сторону общих врагов. «Ах, Андрей Казимирович, она опять угрожала!» «В чем дело?» «Да все то же. Свет в ванной комнате и забрызган пол. Кострицкая заявила, что пожалуется управдому. Это известие вывело меня из себя. Я меньше других пользуюсь канализацией. В кухню почти не вхожу. Могу я компенсировать кухню за счет ванной комнаты? Ну и пусть, ответила Велескова. Она сама жжет свет киловаттами. А ее дети разбили мою бутылку. Пусть придет управдом. Я понимал, что призыв к вмешательству власти был бы с моей стороны чистейшей воды авантюрой. Чему лишний раз обращать на себя внимание? «Успокойтесь, Андрей Казимирович», — сказала Вероника. «Все нелады с соседями я беру на себя. Успокойтесь, прошу вас». Она протянула руку, чтобы потрогать мне лоб. Я успел отшатнуться. «Нет, здоров и никакой температуры. Давайте ужинать». На столе дымилась и скверно пахла еда. Меня всегда поражал садизм кулинарии. Будущих цыплят поедают в жидком виде. Свиные внутренности набиваются собственным мясом. Кишка, проглотившая себя и облитая куриными выкидышами. Вот что такое на самом деле яичница с колбасой. Еще безжалостней поступают с пшеницей. Режут, бьют, растирают в пыль. Не потому ли мука и мука разнятся лишь ударением? «Скажите, Андрей Казимирович, вы очень одиноки?» — спросила Вероника, внося в комнату чайник. Пока находила за чайником, я вывалил свое блюдо в газету. «У вас были друзья?» — она положила сахар. «Дети?» — еще ложку сахару. «Любимая женщина?» Размешивать. По всему было заметно, что Вероника волнуется. «Друзей мне заменяйте вы», — начал я осторожно. «А что касается женщин, вы же видите, я стар и горбат». «Старый горбат», — повторил я с неумолимой настойчивостью. Я честно желал предотвратить признание. Зачем оно мне, когда и без этого трудно? Стоит ли портить наш военный союз против злых соседей, возбуждать в себе повышенный интерес, не нашедший применения девушки? Чтобы избежать беды, я был готов прикинуться алкоголиком или преступником, а может лучше умалишенным, педерастом, наконец. Я боялся. Каждое из этих качеств могло придать моей особе опасный, интригующий блеск.
Of course, having ended up here, I faithfully observed the ruling fashions, adhered to the rules of the country in which I was compelled to live. Moreover, the constant danger of being caught and exposed forced me to tug these masquerade-like scraps onto my body. But if I were in their shoes, I would not only never take off my costume, I would keep a giant fur coat on day and night. I would get plastic surgery to make my legs shorter and at least get a hump. The hunchbacks here are a little more decent than the others after all, though even they are freaks. In a sad mood, I set out for Hertz Street. That selfsame hunchback rented a room in a basement apartment across from the conservatory. I'd been keeping an eye on him for more than a month now. This graceful, bent creature who did not resemble a human and who somehow recalled to me my own long-lost youth. I'd seen him 3 times in a row in the laundromat and once at the flower shop when he was buying a cactus. By a stroke of luck, I had found out his home address from the laundry receipt he'd presented. The time had come to dot the I. I kept telling myself that it couldn't be, that everyone had been killed, and I was the only survivor, like Robinson Crusoe. After all, I had liquidated everything that was left after the accident with my own hands, and there were no others here like me. But what if he had been sent for me? In the guise of a hunchback, keeping under wraps. They were showing that they cared. They had changed their minds and set off on the search. How would they know after 32 years, even if that is just according to the local time? Alive and well, nothing to sneeze at.
Конечно, попав сюда, я следовал общей моде. Блюди законы той страны, в которой вынужден жить. К тому же постоянная опасность быть пойманным и увлеченным заставляла меня натягивать поверх тела все эти маскарадные тряпки. Но будь я на их месте, я бы не только из костюма, я бы из шубы не вылезал ни днем, ни ночью.
But when push comes to shove, I fall silent. And as soon as I see something dense and low, gogru. When I hear something fast, zglyagu. And the indescribably exquisite Pkhentz sanctifies my trunk. Ever fewer of these words remain in my fading memory. The sounds of human speech can only approximate their construction. And if the linguists surround me and ask what these things are, I will only say, Gogr tuzhoroskip, and wring my hands. But I am no bastard. If someone is just different, why do you have to insult him right away? How foolish to measure my beauty according to your own ugliness. I am more beautiful and more normal than you. And every time I look at myself, I know this to be obviously true.
Если бы я хоть плакать мог по мере своего рассказа, а то смеяться кое-как научился, а плакать не умею. Сочтут безумцем, фантазером, еще к судебной ответственности могут привлечь. Фальшивый паспорт, подделка подписей, печати и прочие незаконные действия. А если даже вопреки рассудку поверят, будет еще хуже. Я стану известен как Лев Толстой, как Гулливер и Геркулес, и Галилео Галилей. Но при всем этом общенародном внимании к моей скромной особе никто ничего не поймет. И что подбодрить себя, станут смеяться нахально, оттопыривать брезгливые губы. Ах, какой ненормальный, какой некрасивый ублюдок. А я не ублюдок. Если просто другой, так уже сразу ругаться. Нечего своими ростами измерять мою красоту. Я красивее вас и нормальная.
Kastritskaya had sabotaged the bathtub to doom me, and the hole in the wall that gushed water waiting to be fixed had been stopped with a plug of wood, and the water was not flowing. So when everyone had gone to bed, and when the rooms on the floor above me, the floor below me, and the floors to both sides were all giving out steady snores, I took down Veronika's tub from where it hung in our toilet among the other neighbors' tubs. It rumbled like thunder while I dragged it along the corridor, and on the lower floor beneath me, someone stopped snoring. But I completed my task to the bitter end, boiled a kettle in the kitchen, filled a bucket with cold water, and carried all of this to my room, where I locked myself in and stuck the key in the keyhole from the inside. How pleasant it was to throw off my clothes, take off my wig, tear off the ears made of real rubber, and undo the straps drawn tight across my back and chest.
Мое тело раскрылось. Точно пальма, принесенная в свернутом виде из магазина. Все члены, затекшие за день, ожили и заиграли. Я остановился в корыте, одной рукой схватил губку, чтобы размазывать воду по всем сухим местам, другой — чайник, а в третью руку взял кружку с холодной водой. Добавил туда кипятку, попробовал оставшейся четвертой рукой, не слишком ли горячо получилось. До чего удобно. Кожа хорошо всасывала драгоценную жидкость, льющуюся на меня с высоты из эмалированной кружки. И, утолив первый голод, я решил осмотреть себя повнимательнее, чтобы смыть нездоровую слизь, выступившую из пор и застывшую кое-где сухими лиловыми сгустками. Правда, мои глаза на руках и ногах, на темени, на затылке начали заметно слабеть. скрытый в дневное время с жесткой одеждой и накладной шевелюрой. Один глаз ослеп еще в 1934 году, натертый правым ботинком. Может быть, не живи я на чужбине 32 года, мне бы и в голову не пришло любоваться своей внешностью. Но здесь я единственный образчик той утраченной, гармонической красоты, что зовется моей родиной.
The last passage we will read comes from the beginning of the last chapter of the book. And I will add just that things are really starting to break down for our hero in this last chapter. A terrible hustle and bustle in nature, neurosis everywhere, leaves rushing to drop, sparrows singing spasmodically, children rushing to exams at the schools and technical colleges, the voices of nannies in the yards, shrieky and hysterical. Even the air is stale. The kastritskaya odor in small doses has suffused everything. Even the cactuses on the windowsill smell like lemon in the mornings. I mustn't forget to give Veronika my cactuses before I leave. I'm afraid the final illness has gotten to me. It has not only broken my body, but has also crippled my soul. Strange desires occasionally visit me. Sometimes I feel like going to the movies. Other times I want to play checkers with Veronika's husband. I hear he is very good at checkers and chess.
Перечел свои записки и остался недоволен. Здесь в каждой фразе влияние чужеродной среды. Кому нужна эта болтовня на местном диалекте? Не забыть и сжечь перед отъездом. Ведь людям я не собираюсь показывать. А наши все равно не прочтут и ничего обо мне не узнают. Наши не залетят никогда в такую несусветную дичь. Дети – такие пышные кактусята. Не забыть отдать Веронике. Теперь они должны быть большенькие. Вася ходит в школу. Почему в школу? Он уже взрослый, солидный, стал инженером. А Маша вышла замуж. Господи, я, кажется, становлюсь человеком.
No. Thank you so much. And I think it's time to talk a bit more about Pkhentz and what stands, what's really behind these lines that Ainsley and Eugene read. And maybe...
Should we ask it?
Sure. And also the questions that we have been, Ainsley and I have been asking ourselves is just why Pkhentz? Right? Why this strange text from as far in the past as 1957 that we are here reading and publishing as the first book in 2024-25. What's just so special and, should we say, contemporary about it that...
It's about immigration.
Right. Well, because, it takes an alien to alienate all these experiences, perhaps including, of course, immigration. This phrase, what else is there to do on Earth for 32 years other than basically to admire one's motherland is, of course,
the motherland inside you.
Sure. Of course, Sushinsky, who did emigrate, having served the 7 years of prison in 1973, when he was writing it, there was hardly any thought. Even if he does send Pkhentz to Herzen script at some point. Herzen, of course, was the first publisher and exile from Tsarist Russia in the mid-19th century. Yeah, so it's a really carefully kind of crafted miniature, perhaps, of historical periods and centuries, in fact, given that even Herzen is there. But those not going only back into the past, but of course into the future. And so today it is about immigration, of which, if we only speak of the Russian context, we are having about the fifth wave today. But it's also, eerily enough, it's of course about both prison and release from prison in a sense, isn't it? So he might be read as either a prisoner or as one who is incapable of adjusting to life back at freedom. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we didn't read this one passage, but when the hero eventually does track down this hunchback whom he suspects of being a fellow alien, they have this exchange, which we've talked about before because it's one of the kind of translation failures, because it's very compact in Russian. Once they finally get together and are alone, our hero and the hunchback, who turns out to be a human after all, our hero addresses him and says, "Вы давно оттуда?" And the hunchback says, "Откуда оттуда?" Right? So, and I don't even know how the translation is, but I can tell you in a minute. How long since you came from there? I asked directly. Came from where? He avoided answering, right? So it's like, it's not quite as nicely minimalist as in the Russian, but the point is, and also in the Russian, in the context of this thaw moment, when some of the truth about the Gulag had been revealed, оттуда, where you know, have you come back from out there? How long has it been since you got back? Refers, of course, to Siberia, which is another layer of irony because, of course, the hero has come from Siberia, which is where his spaceship crash landed. And so that's made pretty clear through that interaction. All of these things, right? To be Jewish, to be a former prisoner, to be queer, like take your pick, marginal identity, like free for all. And it is possible to read it through all of those lenses and more, to be an alien.
Question to you, Ainsley, about the experience of translating it and why, you really wanted to do it. What was the greatest difficulty? I mean, I noticed that you also had translated pederast into child molester. Yes, I just want to hear, some of the choices you've had to make.
He uses the male singular pronoun. So even though we are given abundantly to understand that this creature does not fit into the gender binary, as far as he as a character, he is very consistently referred to as he. So Yasha mentioned that I had been interested in translating this for a long time. I have a great friend who I was in grad school with the first time I was in grad school in North Carolina, Kevin Reese, who consulted also on the translation. And he gave me this to read years and years ago when I was just doing a master's there. And it was always one of his favorite Sinyavsky stories. So it always just had a very special place in my heart.
It's also extremely intertextual. There is Mayakovsky in it, there is like whatnot. So it begs for
even like, the Tertz an example. If in an English edition you could explain that. Pederast, we really struggled with it because homosexual in English is pretty neutral, right? And so since he is rattling off a list of kind of undesirables, we were looking for something that would sound more repellent, I guess, to the English ear. I mean, we could have just gone for some other slur, I suppose, but it certainly wasn't meant to obscure anything. More just trying to think of things that are obviously societally condemned. Although the context changes all the time, right? Otherwise, like I told about this Atudat Kuda problem, we decided, you will have noticed, because it was one of the passages that we read, he plays this game with Muka Muka. And I decided on this kind of explanatory reproduction translation for that because, as I pointed out to Yasha, he's not a native speaker of Russian, right? And so it actually fits quite well. You know, in the Russian, you could hear that he just rattles it off like a fun pun, but it kind of fits with the storyline for him to say, oh, these weird Russians, right? With their muka muka.
Which also makes it such a perfect example of, you know, foreign language acquisition. It's his experience of having mastered, but let's say having achieved what you call it, near native level? Near native. Not quite native yet because he's still de-automatizing word usage and even syntax, I think. Makar не гонял. This is only part of the phraseological expression, right? But he uses it as if he has like exceeded the native level, right? And uses it counting that, well, certainly it would kind of domesticate or acculturate him even further. And he's doing this to himself because that's nothing but his diary of sorts, or notes. It's not for the public. But nevertheless in a foreign language.
The first thing that comes to my mind is that Sinyavsky has this vested interest in like folklore and these kind of categories of more elemental categories of culture.
But he's deliberately using the extraterrestrial character to highlight what had been taboo in the Soviet kind of official discourse, including all the bodily functions and physiology and of course sexuality. Andrei is just like...
He sounded almost like an amateur anthropologist to me in a way,
exactly.
since he was talking about, he was also analyzing why this exists in society, the cultural...
I'm a little bit curious. As much of this is a fantasy, there's a veiled criticism of society in many aspects. I understand why at that time this was published abroad, but I guess the secret services in the Soviet Union knew about this book. So was there any difficulty in life for the authors and for the publishers or not?
Of course they knew about the book, but they had no idea who the author was. So there was no one to punish for it until the secret services did their homework and revealed the two authors who kept publishing under these pen names for as long as 8 years at least. And yes, that's when it became an investigation culminating in this show trial of 1966.
Sinyavsky is violating the kind of unwritten rules around depiction of sex, physiology, a certain level of grotesque in terms of what was standard. But there really isn't, even as we have our amateur anthropologist Alien describing this society, there's really no criticism of like the political order. If you were reading it, I don't know, as an American with little knowledge of the Soviet Union, you might be shocked by the existence of the communal apartment and the fact that people have to share a bathroom and a kitchen. But other than that, he's an accountant, right? He has like woman problems. I don't see, compared to especially earlier Soviet work and other things written by dissidents.
So if that
right?
is so, why couldn't this book be published within the Soviet Union? Why did it have to be published abroad?
The first thing actually, a programmatic text by Sushinsky/Tertz that he not only published but also wrote as Tertz was this essay called On Socialist Realism, where he spells out what all the prerequisites, everything that there has to be in a work of literature, art for that matter, that earns it a publication, official publication in Gosses.dat, right? So among those things would be, as you probably know, like a positive hero, right? There has to be some purpose that this positive hero is trying to achieve, and ultimately, of course, triumphs. So there has to be a happy end of sorts as well. You might say it's all like part and parcel of folklore, right? Which it is. But there is clearly no happy end in Pkhentz. Is he positive, negative? It's also beyond these categories. Certainly, he isn't a hero, and his only purpose is what?
To be beautiful.
But try and kind of explain that this is a lofty purpose, that's a whole other question.
First of all, it's language. What couldn't be published, it's not the contents, it's style. That's Galileo Galilei, that's kind of like whatever wonderful one word, one Gulliver, Геркулес, Galileo Galilei и химик, биохимик. Это абсолютно невозможно. The main point is the language. And that's the main difference between him and his contemporary who published. And that's possible. And here he goes beyond the Soviet language so beautiful. That's why it's so beautiful. And Ainsley, you did it. You really brought it into English, this beauty of the language.
Is this alliteration? Is it because the language is less than transparent? But it seems fairly transparent to me.
It is absolutely transparent, but it's not the language of the Soviet literature.
But what's wrong with Galileo Galilei?
They all start with G.
Yeah. No, because it's a linguistic joke. And literature is not a joking matter. You may be allowed it on the level of Ilfy Petrov, but that's the last time when you allowed it. And there's a moment, and we have another 30, 40 years in between that we're not allowed to do that. And it's he wrote it 56.
I mean, I don't know if Galileo Galilei on its own is enough, right? But there is the talking vagina. So there's other things that could be too.
That probably would not work.
Yeah. No, sex, of course, but it's not just about
There is no sex.
There is no sex.
there's no sex.
But not for
there is a
the
talking vagina.
not for the reason that there was no sex in the Soviet Union, for a whole other reason.
It's about body deviation. That's also thing which was not allowed in the Soviet Union to be what now is a very important topic, acceptance of people who do not look like you. And that topic, he's probably the very first writer who writes about it, in the Soviet context. Accepting of the other,
And it is interesting. It's 57, right? It's the year of the big festival with all the foreigners who have come, right?
It is also the year of the Sputnik, with which perhaps he is hoping to fly back. But
This is just on a little bit more of a technical level. Like, did you happen to notice as you were doing the translation any just patterns in the ways that you were deviating from the first English version?
It's a difference of voice. It's also a difference of time, right? Because the first English version was made not that long after it was written. And one of the things that we say about translation is that even great translations can get old, right? Especially in a text like this that is written in a very conversational language with these kind of fun phrases and linguistic jokes. And so I think when there is always a part of me that ends up in whatever I translate. And so I think Sushinsky has a very distinctive rhythm that Olga was just pointing toward, just in terms of how the sentences work. So that stays. But I think that some of the lexicon is probably more typical of English of today. Some of the phrases that I don't even necessarily think about, but they're the first thing that comes to mind. Yeah. But no, I can't think of anything like really concrete that I was like, oh, I'm going to do that differently.
Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness came out in 1969, in which you have an alien race that doesn't have the same gender binary. And she got raked over the coals by having the default be he in it, right? Because in 1969, we didn't have the same kind of discourse that we do now, obviously, right? But I was thinking about the fact that in this, it's just a he, right? And of course, the cactus metaphor is just so powerful in so many ways. There's so many. It's just the perfect choice, I think. And I don't know if he ever commented about that, but I had a similar question. I'm wondering if other translations were happening during like the sexual revolution, for example. Do any other translators kind of play with any of this, or do they really stick very closely to what he had to say?
That's a great question about translations from the 60s and 70s, and I can't answer it. Also, we were joking about how there's no sex in the story because there was no sex in the Soviet Union. Yeah. Which is that thing that gets said. And so it's also true that there are not that many works. Even if you're like a lot of my research has been about underground literature. Even in underground literature, the sex that is there is usually, I don't know, like kind of juvenile in the way that it's like, we know we're getting away with something naughty. I feel like, as many of you know, the question of pronouns and kind of fluidity and creativity around gender is very big in Russian now, even though it's not supposed to be from an official perspective. But even when I read like feminist writers of the earlier like underground period, because feminism was only underground, I don't see a lot of people are not like the binary is not really being questioned, right? There's the question of how women are treated.
What I want to ask you is, what is your way of reading it and also enunciating it, given your expertise on the Beril, on the Soviet generation of authors who work in a sense, but way before the Soviet dissidents, who work against same, socialist realists, but through very different means in their own ways. Is that, of course, it's something quite different,
That's
right?
super different. Yeah.
Super different, but is this
This makes
experimental?
me think, well, first of all, obviously, it's Moscow, 57, Shklovsky's still alive, right? It's, apart from other things, it's an exercise in настранение. Right? And it's an exercise in настранение that goes both ways, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, the creature is trying to understand our world, if it's the same world. And there you just have lots and lots and lots of just literal настранение as a device. But then we're also trying to imagine him, right? And my experience with Sinyavsky is through futurism and formalism. So that's, I took classes with Sinyavsky in Paris, and it was precisely classes on futurism, right? Or a class on futurism. And so that's how it seems to me.
Thank you.
What do you have in mind, like the neologisms,
No,
like
it's I think it's a bigger phenomenon, something that he himself coined, referred to as fantastic realism, and kind of spells out the program for fantastic realism as not so much a rejection, but like as an alternative to socialist realism, but also as an antidote of sorts, because socialist realism is ultimately not funny, he claims, and sure enough, he kind of corroborates this by introducing some elements of humor to Pkhentz.
Here, you just have so much on relativity, right? I mean, that's why we can project so much on it, right? But it also, even in the section that we read, when he starts talking about language, about linguistic attrition, but also about the feeling of the родной язык, right? And how he doesn't even remember what these words mean anymore, what they refer to. I mean, to me, ultimately, this is kind of a Humboldtian line of thinking about language that once again goes to futurism and formalism.
I hadn't realized until you just said it that this is basically that ending of Pkhentz is Dir Burshil.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And it made me think, like, one of the things I was wondering, I was thinking about your comment about the phantasmagoric literature, right? How he ends that essay. And that essay goes together very easily with The Trial Begins, because he concludes the essay basically by saying that now that God is dead, we can sort of enjoy, like, taking apart, right, his, like, flesh, right? And that's what he says phantasmagoric literature is, and you see kind of like that playing with the dead Stalin figure in Trial Begins. So my question was like, well, what is dead here, right, that you're playing with? So is it in fact Khrushchev who is dead? Is it actually modernism who's dead?
He's not dead for another 10 years.
It's human society that's dead.
Or modernism, or that idea, the животворящее, like, you know, like the word that creates life, is it dead? Is that the word that's dead?
While for Pkhentz is nothing but a fast. So it's this kind of physiological restriction in the midst of these lavish, dinners that Veronica throws and invites him and subjects him to. And then, yeah.
I mean, does it help that he is dead at the end?
Well, we don't know that.
His language is dead.
Well, he's okay. I mean,
He's losing his language in the end. Like he speaks neither Russian nor Pkhentz.
Right. Only like German.
Yeah,
and
like
cat
it's kind
language.
of coming out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And meow meow.
All right, and then he starts mumbling about this whole well, go on. He must be at the institute already, right? And he sort of got what he's saying, right? And that sense of like the language, the Russian language he starts using becomes automatic, right? It
I was
starts
gonna
flowing out
say
of
that part is automatization.
So he's lost,
That's the we've had this nice continuous astranение, like permanent revolution.
Yeah.
But then oh no. Like they're finally getting to me. This stuff is starting to seem normal.
Yeah, and,
right?
And it starts with this mama moment, right?
It's in fact quite paranormal, given that, well, he's been Andrei Kazimirovich Sushinsky. He has been on Earth for 32 years, right? Which allows us to kind of trace his crash landing outside Irkutsk, near Irkutsk, to 1925, right? Which is the year of Sinyavsky's birth. Will be the centennial year this year, by the way. But then, and it's written in 57. Guess how many years pass before it is, after all, at the end of the day, nevertheless does get published in the Soviet Union, in Russia, still in the Soviet Union. Another 32 exactly. And that makes it 1989. Which certainly not even Sinyavsky, the fantastic realist author, could have planned or engineered or programmed or So that's the kind of paranormal qualities and power
Fantastic.
of Pkhentz. And that's perhaps really where the fantastic comes in, because he does come back in some sense, right? Not to his native planet perhaps, but to, as a text, back to where it was written, or he was written, or invented. We don't know if he even makes it back to Irkutsk, back to the spit, which their spaceship left, like the crater. But that's what he longs to do, and he already kind of knows what he would be doing over there. He would wait, and then, if anything, he would strike the match and set himself and his notes on fire. So, hello Bulgakov, manuscripts don't burn, right? So maybe that's also what's dead in some way from the Master and Margarita, right? From a whole different period, certainly.
Well, and it's a like дополнительное поражение, right? Because here we are reading it, right? I need a pen.
I don't think you still know what you have done, translating this into English so beautifully. I think it will have a much longer life now, hence than it used to. It's not out of
I have started giving my